Hi everybody, welcome back to Buy the Book. Today we're going to be doing the second review of the Adventures of Tintin series, Tintin in the Congo. Oh man, this is a controversial one. So Tintin in the Congo was serialised between 1930 and 1931 and followed on from the success of Land of the Soviets. Yeah, despite what I said last time and how much I disliked the story and how much in general people nowadays dislike the story, Land of the Soviets for its time was actually quite a big success. It brought many young readers to Le Petit Vingtième, the magazine that Hergé worked for. It got a lot of new eyes, a lot of attention. Hergé became quite a household name across Belgium. And I think, in a way, it was largely because it started, or it certainly had some influences in building what would later become the Franco-Belgian comic scene. So I think, in some ways, that was partly where it all sort of stemmed from. So despite that, Tintin in the Congo was then released in Le Petit Vingtième, 2 pages at a time, similar to before, between 1930 and 1931. And this one has a lot of problems. In fact, certainly more so than Land of the Soviets, which I'm going to get into now. I've got a lot to say about this one, and a lot of what I've got to say is not very good. So let's start off with all the bad things first, and then we'll get to the very few good things that there are about this story. And even then, whether I'd call them good or just average, we'll certainly see later on. So let's start off with the actual story itself. The plot is almost non-existent in this story. In fact, there virtually is nothing of value to this story. There is something a little bit later on which I will talk about when I come to the good stuff of the story, or the very few good things that I think is in the book, like I said. But yeah, effectively what this is Tintin on vacation in the Belgian Congo, which is now the modern day Democratic Republic of the Congo. Back then, written in the 1930s, it was still part of the Belgian Congo. And yeah, effectively, Tintin in the story, he goes on one big vacation. They kind of say at the start of the story that he's doing a report on Africa, but there's basically no reporting that he does. At least in Land of the Soviets, there were a couple of times where you could see him doing a report, or at least there was some sort of reason for him being there. Whereas in this story, he's taken a vacation, he goes over to Africa. He has quite a chaotic start, let's certainly say that. When he's on the boat, there's a lot of kind of quick fire gags that are going on at the very start, in which Snowy first of all gets bitten by a parrot, then he falls overboard, and then he gets bitten by mosquitoes. So there's quite a lot of these silly little gags that start off the story. And then once Tintin does get to Africa is where I would say the real trouble starts. So yeah, let's kind of get into that now. This book is without a doubt racist, just through and through. There is no excusing it, there's no justifying it. I know that obviously back in the day, in the 1930s in Europe, people had very, very different attitudes towards Africans and indigenous people of Africa. But just from the way that this book kind of, certainly the tone that it gives off, and sometimes just flat out blatantly in the language that it uses, it's racist. The way that the Africans are drawn, they've got these very exaggerated features, which obviously, without saying it directly here, knowing what they're kind of being compared to in that sense, they're also kind of portrayed as quite docile, lazy, stupid, having to rely on Tintin or rely on Europeans to sort out their problems. They're in many cases treated very, very unfairly, looked down on. Tintin has this very, very arrogant attitude towards the locals in some cases, and there's a few scenes that I'm going to highlight in a moment. But yeah, this to me is one of the main, certainly if not the main issue with the story. I think the fact that now things have generally moved on and people have a much better attitude towards different races and different ethnic groups around the world. You can certainly see that this does not fit in the modern day, and there's certainly nothing much about this story that has aged well, let's just put it that way. The second thing that I'd like to kind of mention here that I think is another huge negative is the flat out animal abuse, and the fact that Tintin is effectively just a big game hunter in this story. That's all he's over there for. He's just there to shoot and kill animals. There's some quite almost graphic imagery which is they're trying to sort of portray it in like a fun comedic light. I'll give you an example of this. So there's a part in the story where a monkey jumps down from a tree and it snatches Snowy and then takes him back up to the tree. And Tintin decides, oh, I can't possibly shoot the monkey because it's holding Snowy, I might accidentally hit Snowy. So his way of solving this problem is, rather than just waiting for the monkey to go up into the tree or to get bored or, to swing over to another tree or anything like that, he decides to shoot another monkey, skin it, and then wear the skin to then confuse the other monkey that he's a friend of the monkey, and then the monkey will hand Snowy back to him. Yeah, that's really how he resolved that situation. That's just pretty much psychopathic, without putting a finer point on it. Tintin is like a sociopath, a psychopath, and he just happily will wear that monkey skin rather than just maybe wait for the monkey to hand Snowy back to him. So, yeah, you have these examples like that. It makes a lot of light out of, basically animal abuse and animal cruelty. There's a part in the story where Tintin, there's a crocodile that's coming after him, and he decides, rather than just, trying to find a way to move the crocodile away or just simply running away from it because they're not particularly fast, he decides to stick the barrel, or to stick his gun inside the crocodile's mouth lengthways up so its mouth is stuck open. He feeds a boa constrictor its own tail. There's a part in the story where he shoots about 15 antelopes one after the other, and it kind of makes the joke that because it all looked like they're in the same position, that Tintin couldn't tell the difference whether it was one or like 15, 16 of them. There's a part later on in the story where Tintin disposes of a leopard by feeding it a sponge full of water, which will of course rupture its stomach. He then proceeds to just kick it up the backside and kick it out into the wild. So, yeah, there's a lot of these kind of panels like that. There's a lot of these gags like that, which, to me, it kind of makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, really. It doesn't make you feel too good about it. And actually coming off that, those two main things, really, and obviously mentioning the plotless story almost, this story has received a lot of criticism over the last few years. In fact, there were some attempts in Western countries to ban it outright. I think in Britain, I remember there being a story in 2007, 2008 where there was a children's bookshop called Borders that we have in the UK, or a bookshop in general. And this book was actually restricted to the adult section because they felt it was no longer appropriate to show it to children because of the sort of colonialist themes, the animal cruelty, and obviously the imagery of, racism and big game hunting, that sort of thing, and, the outright abuse really that goes on in the book towards Africans and towards the animals. And yeah, kind of following on from that, another major thing I have with this story is, which I've kind of just touched upon already, is that Tintin is just not very likeable in this story. Despite what I said in Land of the Soviets, where yes, that story did have its problems, I did generally find Tintin okay. It kind of introduced him to his intelligence. He did have, some sort of redeeming qualities, and it did help the story a little bit. But in this story, Tintin is just, he's just an arsehole, really. He's like a psychopathic, colonialist, little imperialist arsehole, pretty much throughout the story. He treats the locals very, very bad. There's even some times where Snowy sort of joins in with this as well. And there's a part of the book where Tintin's driving in a car and his car gets stuck on the train tracks, and there's a train coming. And this train is full of like the local African people, and effectively the two collide on the track, and this was Tintin's mistake, so obviously it's therefore his problem to fix. He got stuck on the tracks, the train was just going along, and the train then smashed into Tintin's car. And rather than sorting the problem out himself, he basically forced the Africans on the train to prop their train back up and then help him restart his car and then fix the train as well, while he kind of stood over them and watched. And Snow even kind of joins in with this mocking a little bit as well. There's a part later on where Tintin is... Actually, it happens a few times throughout the story where Tintin is basically getting carried around like he's their master, or he's being worshipped by them. There's a lot of imagery where the Africans will be on their hands and knees worshipping Tintin and stuff like that. And yeah, you probably get the point by now, guys. There's a lot of racist imagery in this story. The plot itself is almost non-existent. Tintin is a very, very unlikable character. There's lots of scenes of animal abuse that are going on. The ways in which Tintin solves some of these gags is just flat out ridiculous. So yeah, there's not a lot good about this story. It's a really, really terrible story. I think, unfortunately, Hergé was, because of the type of newspaper he was working for at the time, which was a very conservative newspaper. Unfortunately, this has really backfired in the modern day, and thankfully, what happened later on is that although the series, of course, did massively improve, and a lot of this stuff was completely gone by the end of it, Hergé did actually end up disavowing the early stories, saying that they were, I think he said something like they were a sin of his youth or something like that, which, yeah, rightfully so, because there's a lot of real problems with this. But again, kind of what I said to Land of the Soviets, it does sort of give us a bit of a window into how Europeans thought back in the day, what their racist attitudes were towards Africans, and ultimately, guys, it is a product of its time, so we do view things now, thankfully, very different. But yeah, this story, as you can tell, it does have a lot of problems. Okay, guys, so let's get down to the good stuff of the story. We've talked for a long time now about all the bad things. Let's talk about the very few good things that there are in the story. So, number one are the drawings. I generally think, putting the Africans aside because of what I said earlier about their exaggerated features and all that, when it comes to the drawings, I'm talking in terms of the background, in terms of like the buildings, how that they look, and the landscapes, that type of thing. I think they are a step up from Land of the Soviets. There does seem to be more detail. They do seem to be a lot more clearer, and yeah, it just seems to be better drawn overall, more well drawn. So I'd certainly say that is a step up from the previous story. The next thing is not necessarily a comparison to Land of the Soviets or a step up from before, but there is a part of the story where there is a gangster. There's kind of like a continuous villain throughout the story, and he's someone who we later find out was hired by Al Capone to basically dispose of Tintin because Al Capone wanted to start up diamond production in Africa to expand his criminal empire. And one of his agents, one of the people who he hires, was effectively sent to dispose of Tintin. And we learn this a little bit later on, and we figure out who this guy was. Later on in the story, a guy who regularly appears early on, and yeah, I think had the story focused more on that rather than just Tintin going around hunting animals and being a little idiot towards Africans, I think it could have actually been a pretty effective story, and it could have been quite interesting. Maybe had they focused a lot more on that side of things and not made this villain just a guy who turns up to, try and get this one up gag on Tintin over and over again. Like I said, I think it would have certainly been a much more effective story, and I think had it been focused on that, things would have turned out a lot better. Aside from that, though, guys, that's literally it. They're literally the two things I can think of that are good about the story. Basically, the drawings are an improvement, and there's that small part of the story which is focused on Tintin being disposed of because Al Capone has this criminal empire ambition in Africa, which of course later does follow up in Tintin America, and then it then is found out, which I'll talk about a bit more in the later books that are coming soon. It's this much bigger global plan, really. This much bigger global enterprise. So yeah, that sort of stuff, because it does sort of set up the next few books. I think that's quite good. But yeah, aside from that, I would say they're the only two good things about the story. The rest of it is pretty trash, to be honest. I think it's a very, very poor book. I don't like it at all, to be honest, except those minor things. And unfortunately, I think it is certainly a step down from even Land of the Soviets. I think while that story did have its problems, it still had, number one, a reason for Tintin being in the place he was. He was actually doing some reporting. Number two, this one obviously it takes the racism factor. There was some obviously stereotypical imagery going on in Land of the Soviets, but there was nothing that I kind of would point out that was like really, really racist or really offensive or anything like that. But in this one, that is just turned up to the max. And thankfully, after this story, things did change a lot for the better. And gradually over time, obviously, The Adventures of Tintin became a much better series. So, yeah, with the exception of those two things, there's pretty much nothing else. Okay, guys, so let's get down to the final score of Tintin in the Congo. There's no doubt in my mind I'm going to be giving this story a 1 out of 10. It is one of the worst stories probably that I have read. There's very little about this book that I like, as you know from the review. And yeah, thankfully, and I'm really thankful about this, that the stories did improve massively after this one. There were maybe just a few more things over the next few stories or so that I can remember off the top of my head. I will obviously reread them in preparation for the next reviews. There were a few things which may have been a small lasting impact of like the stereotypes of certain ethnic groups and things like that, but from what I can remember, the actual story content, the plot development, the characters, things like that, all massively improved from this story onwards. So yeah, we've basically got the two weaker stories out of the way, and apart from the odd one or two maybe later on, generally speaking, the adventures are pretty good, and yeah, we should have some pretty good reviews coming up soon. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the review. Obviously, this was a pretty bad review, but like I said just before, yeah, things get better soon, and thankfully, yeah, Tintin grows into a much stronger character. We get a lot of really good adventures coming up, so yeah, things will get better from here on out. Okay, everyone, let me know in the comments what you thought of the review. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you on the next one.